Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is perspective, or maybe even perspectives plural. How gaining perspective or looking at something from different perspectives gives us a greater capability to discern what's real, in big air quotes there. But before we get started, let's just take a couple minutes to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, the first time, imagine that you're inhaling clean, crisp oxygen deep into your lungs, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy throughout your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take a second breath deep in through your nose. Hold it and imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating and electrifying all your cells, all your molecules, all your electrons, and bringing energy and light throughout all portions of your body and being, and emanating out and beyond into the world. As you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together. Softly, softly rub your fingers against your palms and feel how delicious that sensation is. And bring yourself present right here, right now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So we're talking about perspectives, and it's so interesting if we just consider good morning, Andrea. Welcome, welcome. So good to have you here with us today. We're talking about perspective, and we're going to start by talking about perspective, the visual perspective, because we all know that based on the angle or the perspective from which we observe something, it can be very, very different in appearance. So from certain perspectives, things look very, very, very big, and other perspectives, the same thing can look very, very, very small. And sometimes based on perspective, the thing that we're looking at is uninterpretable, is unintelligible. We can't figure out what it is. Good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you here. We're talking about perspectives and how the perspective from which we view something can either make it more easy to interpret or impossible to interpret. And by assuming different perspectives visually on something, we get a better experience of what that thing is. I mean, you can imagine looking at a image of a room, for instance. When you look at it from above, you can't necessarily see how tall things are, right? Because you're looking from the top down. And so you can't see how big things are. You can see spatially how they might be relating to each other from a flat plane, but it's very different from if you took a photograph from the floor, for instance, looking up at all these things. They'd be very, very, very big relative to the way that they really existed in relation to each other in that space. So based on our perspective, we have a very different perception of visual things, but also we can use that as a metaphor for the way we think about things. Good morning, Dennis. So good to have you here. We're talking about perspective and how perspective impacts our interpretation of experience. So if we get into interpersonal experience, we can understand that when we're told a story by a person who was the action figure in this story, it's going to be a very different story from the perspective of the person who had this quote unquote same experience as a bystander, for example. And what I think we don't realize is, and this is actually a similar conversation to the conversation on assumptions, we don't realize that we are seeing things from a particular perspective, and we each have a unique perspective on things in the world, whether it's actual things that we're perceiving or whether it's scenarios or circumstances that we're perceiving. And I'm playing with the idea. Hello, Robert. Welcome. So good to have you here with us. So we're talking about perspective and how, I don't know if you guys have ever done perspective drawing. So 1 point, 2 point, 3 point perspective. It shifts the relationships of things to each other when you're drawing from these different perspectives. And I wonder if by gaining different perspectives, by expanding our own perception through others, the perceptions or perspectives of others, if we might not be able to come to a richer understanding of what might actually be there that's being perceived, you know, whether it's circumstance, dynamics, whatever. And this gets to the question of the idea of changing our minds. And I guess this is maybe this will be the topic for tomorrow, is changing our minds. What does that actually mean? So what, I guess it makes me question, what's our mind to begin with? You know, if I'm changing my mind, then my mind is made up and I'm changing my mind. And if, you know, this is really interesting. When we think of the term, my mind is made up, what we think of is I've made a decision, right? But what if it's more like we made it up, like we fabricated it, and it's all fabricated? So like this idea of perspectives is gleaning information that can expand the construct that we are making up when we make up our minds. What do you think? So from taking perspective, I mean, we don't usually use the word perspective when we think about sound, but we hear sounds from different areas, right? When we hear sound, it's relative also to where we are and where the sound is. And if we shift our position, we're talking in reality and metaphor here. If we shift our position, then our experience of that sound changes, right? And oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I think that's, maybe it's energy release, maybe it's just exhaustion, I'm not sure. Anyway, so shifting perspective, what is that? What are we doing when we're shifting perspective, or we have a unique perspective, or we're getting some perspective on something? What do these things mean? I think that the idea is that we're enhancing our the veracity of our perception. We're enhancing what we believe to be approaching the truth. Truth may be idealized is with a capital T. I don't know that we actually, as human beings, have the opportunity or ability or capacity to experience truth with a capital T, because everything that we experience is funneled through this filter of perspective, and and influenced by perspective, right? So we don't have access to experience outside of our filtering mechanisms. Now, there are states of consciousness and awareness which we do have the capacity to access, which maybe mitigates a lot of those filters and allows perhaps a more accurate flow of information. However, there is always that filter, right? Our senses serve as filters. Good morning, Isabel. So good to have you here. Our senses, we're talking about perspective and perspectives, and how by shifting our vantage point, we get to see a different perspective. If we shift our perception, our position, it shifts our perception, and our perspective can shift. And if we can collectively or compile these perspectives, it can give us a greater sense of what's there, whether it be a thought or a circumstance or something visual or auditory, or in other words, in other ways, sensual, something that we're perceiving through our senses. So it's interesting as I'm thinking about perspective drawing. It's interesting to think about how it's very formula driven, very formulaic, in that you have these lines that go to the horizon, and maybe you have one horizon point or another horizon point, but you have these points of convergence where these lines converge, and then the objects that you're trying to represent in space are represented based on the scale created by these lines. And I wonder how we can look at that as a metaphor for the way that we perceive the world, and the way that we perceive other people, and the way that we perceive ourselves. The richness of the perspective, is it 1 point, 2 point, 3 point perspective? When we're at the effect of our triggers and our traumas, and even our beliefs, all of those could be our experiences, our beliefs, our history, our culture. All these could be considered lines that are going to the horizon point, that are kind of dictating the way that we perceive all the elements of the world, whether it's experientially or visually or in other experiences of the senses. I'm having fun kind of thinking about this and seeing, oh, wow, we talk about being off the rails or being on track. And here, we're talking about these perspective lines going to the horizon, kind of like train tracks, that we that we draw boxes within those lines, interestingly, like even when we draw outside the box, if we're drawing in perspective, it's still adhering to those lines. And I wonder how, I think it's interesting, and an interesting exercise to be looking at the familiar, like being in a room. Usually when we're in a room, we're above the floor, when, and we're seeing things at eye level, or when we're seated and we see the world from these particular more habitual type of vantage points. And if you were to lay down on the floor and look at the room, you would see different things. You would see things differently, and you would see different things because different angles would be exposed. So Rosalind says we can be guided by having virtues which to live by. In that case, perspective would be filtered by the virtues we choose to live by. So I am not sure what you mean by virtues, Rosalind, because I think that virtues may be selective in the way that values are selective. The things that we value, the things, virtues, I imagine, are things that we elevate, characteristics, traits that we elevate and aspire to. So it may be virtuous to be kind. It may be virtuous to be gentle. I don't know that it's necessarily something we would consider virtuous to be self-expressed. I'm wondering if that's, like what are the virtues that we would choose to live by? I'm curious because I do a lot of work with people regarding values, and there are aspirational values, and then there are the values that we actually hold. And so I'm wondering if, like, choosing virtues to live by, if that is, it seems to me that could be a very slippery slope in a way to self, to beating oneself up, to say, I'm aspiring to be always always kind, for instance. And then maybe there's a moment where I say or do something that isn't as kind as I think I should be, because that's the virtue that I'm holding for myself. And then I get to berate myself for not meeting that expectation. So I'm wondering, like, I also believe that we can use virtues as guides, to be honest, to be compassionate, to be, I'm not sure what other virtues might be, to be generous. And we can use them as guidelines. And then Maggie, no biting. She just went, and she has a thing about feet, and she goes and bites my feet. Sometimes like really heavily, really violently and painfully. So this time it wasn't, or you would have heard me scream. So Isabel says, yes, it is an exercise I like to take, the emotional pain from situations too. Yes, by shifting perspective. So when we are hurt and feel, for instance, unappreciated by somebody, maybe somebody says something and it feels really harsh or it feels hurtful, we can feel that pain and upset because we feel that they have done something to us, and perhaps that person may have been experiencing something that had nothing to do with us at all, and maybe they were short in their response because they were preoccupied or upset about something in their own lives. So taking that different perspective allows us to have a fuller picture of what may have occurred. And so Rosalind, you've got me so curious about this idea of virtues. Because when this just might be me in my own mind, but virtues somehow make me think of religiousness or religiosity in some way. And so here, Rosalind says, no harm to others, loving kindness, constant of aim and effort, and non-laziness, avoiding excessive remorse, generosity, from Master Choa Kaksui. I hope I said that right. I probably destroyed it. But yeah, so I see loving kindness, not loving and kindness, sorry, but loving kindness. So I walk a fine line between our aspiration to be good people and holding ourselves to a standard that is unachievable and that constantly reaffirms our inadequacies. I think we can use these virtues, values as something to be intending, something to be growing towards, something to be holding ourselves present to, or we can use them as cudgels to beat ourselves with when we don't live up to those very high expectations. And Isabel says, oh, I call those values instead of virtues. And so, you know what, you guys are inspiring me to look up the distinction between values and virtues, because I think, I know for me, like virtue, like I said, feels somewhat religious. And let's see, I'm going to look up virtue for you guys. All right, so virtue, moral excellence. So Rosalind says they help to build character. Yes, I think it can absolutely help to build character if we're aspiring to those virtues, right? Here is more about virtues. Conformity of one's life and conduct to moral and ethical principles, uprightness, rectitude. And then let's see, particular moral excellence, a good or admirable quality or property, effective force, power, or potency. That's talking about something different. But so I agree that when we aspire to that level of excellence, when we aspire to be forthright, virtuous, etc., that is a guide or provides guideposts for us to live within or to aspire to in our lives, with the recognition that we're not always going to achieve that, right? And I think that there can be a righteousness associated also with virtue. So Isabel says, it's a quality you already achieved, virtue. So when we're aspiring to be virtuous, we were first of all saying these things are more important, these things are better than other things, right? When we're assigning virtues. Isabel says value, it is a desire to achieve. So so a virtue is something, oh, I see. So Isabel is saying for her, a value is something that is something to achieve, something, a desired achievement or a desired expression, whereas virtue is something that you already have achieved. It's interesting because I see values as, again, guideposts. Like I value authenticity, for example. So is authenticity a virtue when you embody it? Is it a virtue that you aspire to? Is it a value that you aspire to? Good morning, Bernadette. So good to have you here. We're talking about perspectives, and now we've migrated into a conversation about values and virtues. And it's interesting. It's interesting because I think while I value authenticity, there may be moments in my life when I don't really authentically express myself. And if I could see where I might use that opportunity when I didn't meet my values, when I violated my own value, or I didn't live up to my own value or my own idea of virtues that I established for myself, that I could be making myself wrong and bad instead of recognizing that I'm human and I get to have another opportunity to be in alignment and with my values, with the authentic self-expression. There's something about, like, values. To me, everybody has different values. There's something about the word virtues that has an absolute tone to it in my hearing, and that doesn't mean that it's so. I'm not saying that's the case necessarily, like it's truth, but it's like, if I live by these virtues, then I'm better somehow, or than others, that I am a virtuous person, and there's something righteous about that. I mean, I wonder if we get to say that we are of ourselves, that we're virtuous, or if that's something that other people assess. So interesting, isn't it? The nuance of language and how we interpret it. I find it so remarkable, and it's all about perspective, right? It goes back to perspective, where virtue, in my hearing, again, I'm being really specific, that's just the way that I think about it, doesn't mean it's true. Virtue is something that lives as its own value, so like to be kind-hearted or loving kindness is a virtue. That maybe the thinking is, I agree, Isabella, it is all about perspective. Generosity can be a virtue, it can be a vice. Loving kindness could potentially be a virtue or a vice. So like that's how I'm hearing it. Like, virtue is setting up black and white, it's setting up a polarity is the way that I'm experiencing it. And I wonder if that's something that feels that way to you, if it feels like an opening, if it feels like possibility that's calling you forward. That's awesome. That's awesome. If it's calling you to expand yourself and to grow, that and um, to enrich your expression in the world, that sounds great to me. If instead it's this is it. I think that the word virtue for me carries an underlying should. Like, this is how you should be. This is how you should live. And so there's a prescriptive component to it that I find antithetical to the way that I want to express my life. If I hold something as a value for myself, then I can live within the guideposts there. And sometimes I may go outside the guideposts, but I can bring myself back in to be in alignment with my values, versus like there's not the same should about it. It's more an expression of what is internal to me. The values are deeply ingrained in me. And so it feels true in or it feels like a reflection of myself somehow, the values, rather than this is how I should be. It's more like this is how I am. And that too, of course, is not immutable in any way. So, well, this has been really interesting, and I love this conversation. I really appreciate, Rosalind, that you brought up this idea of virtue, and we got to discuss it, because I don't think I ever recognized my bias around the word virtue. So Rosalind says, everything at your own pace, but every time you break the virtue, the connection to your soul expression becomes thinner. Vices are like mud, keeping you stuck. So I hear what you're saying, and I wonder, sometimes, and like when we fall off the path, so to speak, if we break a virtue, for example, and I'm going to say value also, because I'm sensing that you may be holding virtues as the way that I hold values. I'm not sure. But you say the connection to your soul expression becomes thinner. So in that moment, what happens is that we feel maybe more disconnected, or we feel like we've lost touch with our soul. And when we feel that contrast, it's possible that we would then redouble our connection, that we might come back to that virtue or value even more strongly, having strayed from it, if that makes sense. Like recognizing the contrast, recognizing the discomfort of having strayed from that authentic sense of alignment with our soul and with our values. The pain of that disconnection might help us to make that connection stronger. So I think you make a really good point, whether it be values or virtues. And when we see a behavior as a vice, I see, I just have a challenge with absolutes. I really do. I used to be so black and white in the way that I perceive the world, and right and wrong and up and down, and yes and no and true or false and all these polarities. I used to be so much more black and white about things, and vices and virtues, both feel so absolute to me. That's just me, as you said, everything at your own pace. And so we all have our different perspectives, um, based on where we are in our lives. Position makes perspective, right? So yeah. Thank you for such a provocative conversation. And I invite all of us to be looking at the perspectives through which we see the world, and maybe lay down on the floor and take a look at the room that you're in and see what's different. And Rosalind says there could be many levels of truth. 100%. 100%. Many levels of truth, interpretation, experience, perspective. Absolutely. Thank you, Bernadette. And I wish you also a wonderful day. And I want to thank you guys again just for the wonderful stimulation and provocative conversations. I so appreciate you and your perspectives and your engagement. And I think that's it for today. So I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. And I go live each weekday morning here on Enlightened World Network's Facebook page. Please check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network, on Enlightened World Living, and EWN One with the Earth. Oh, sorry, we missed you too, Lisa, but so good to have you pop in to say, have a wonderful day. And so until next time, so much love.